The Bob Murphy Show, episode 37.
There's a tidal wave coming. What you gonna do?
Get ready for another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. It's your source for commentary and interviews conducted by a Christian and economist. Now here's your host, Bob Murphy.
Everybody, welcome back to The Bob Murphy Show. Today I'm speaking once again with Keith Knight, who is here to make the case that Winston Churchill is not just a big cuddly teddy bear, as you may have been led to believe. And I don't think I need to give too much more prep than that. When we get into the conversation, I give a little bit more of the context in case that helps you get your bearings. Keith is a regular over at the Libertarian Institute, just a powerhouse, and he also has his own podcast, which I would encourage you to check out. I will put links in the show notes page. But for now, enjoy my conversation with Keith Knight on Winston Churchill. Keith, welcome back to the Bob Murphy Show.
Bob, thanks so much for having me.
So the last time I had you on, we originally were going to talk about all things related to World War II in terms of overturning the conventional wisdom, but it was so much material, I said, why don't we break it up? So at that point, we talked about your good buddy FDR, and now we're going to talk about your even better buddy, Winston Churchill. And so people have been taught he's a great guy. He saved democracy, civilization, so forth. Probably one of the greatest statesmen of all time, and an amazing historian to boot, and a cigar aficionado. And you don't exactly come down on that consensus. So what do you have to say for yourself?
Well, I fully agree on the cigar aficionado. I think the evidence is in. The verdict is he is a cigar aficionado. The reason this came across my attention, or I thought to make this post in the first place, was the amount of vitriol that Daryl Cooper and Tucker Carlson received after briefly mentioning the downsides of the Second World War and potential off-ramps that could have been taken in a catastrophe which, according to the National World War II Museum, killed 45 million civilians, millions of soldiers, left people with post-traumatic stress disorder, left people dismembered, burned cities to the ground. Apparently, Tucker Carlson and Daryl Cooper look at this and say, are there any productive lessons that could be learned in hopes of avoiding this conflict in the future, one like this? Whereas the Second World War is so commonly used as, look at how good wars can be. Let's do it again. We took Hitler down. We could take Saddam down. We could take Xi Jinping down. We could fight Vladimir Putin. Don't you remember what we did to Japan? It's just that easy. So Iran is basically nothing compared to the National Socialists. So World War II is constantly used as a justification to engage in further military conflicts because it was a blatant case of good versus evil, and the outcome was unquestioningly good. So that's why I thought this was so important. The first thing...
Hey, Keith, can I jump in? So I'm glad you brought that up again, just to refresh people's memory about that context. So again, folks, Keith had written these posts for the Libertarian Institute, and that's what we're now talking about. Keith's post on Winston Churchill. Of course, we'll link to it at the show notes page. But yeah, I had forgotten, Keith, that Cooper, I love the analogy he made. It was something like, and he did it in several places after this conflict erupted over his remarks on Tucker's show, saying something like, imagine like there's some guy on meth and he takes his wife and kids hostage, and there's a police standoff, and the situation ends and the police just go in guns blazing and everyone dies. And he said, you don't have to say, oh, the guy on meth was a good guy, but you can kind of say after the fact, is there any other way the police could have handled that? It doesn't, for you to ask that question doesn't mean you're pro meth addict and pro kidnapping your own, you know what I mean? And it was just amazing. And you're certainly, like you're saying now, that's why I'm bringing this up. You wouldn't hold that up and call the police that did like the greatest generation. and we should all look to them. And what you know what I mean? Like it might just be like, yeah, that was terrible, and what a horrible day that was. And maybe you think the police had no, but anyway, I'm just explaining the way he's saying the way World War II was held up as like the greatest achievement of our forefathers or something, when no, this was just awful, and couldn't this have been, shouldn't, can we look at that and see what could have been done instead? Because that outcome was horrible.
Exactly. And so what they do is the people like Niall Ferguson, Andrew Roberts, the court historians of today who come on Piers Morgan to defend how, Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill were so great. The goal is, because currently they're saying Joe Biden has all these downsides. Donald Trump, of course, has so many downsides. But what we can do is get a great person in office to do great things. And Winston Churchill is that example. This completely keeps people away from questioning the foundation of the state, the monopoly on violence, which has a monopoly on the printing press, a monopoly on compulsory education, the right to take income by force, the right to regulate commercial interactions between consenting adults. It's all about avoiding the central issue of why the state is bad. They say, no, there's good and bad, and we have all these examples of good. Churchill, Roosevelt, Lincoln. So that's why these myths are so vitally important, because they're used today to justify further violations of the non-aggression principle. The first thing that I mention in this article is important because this gives us a bird's eye view into Winston Churchill in a very unpopular conflict. People say, well, he did bad things in the Second World War. His hands were tied. What we can do is look at Churchill's actions in a war that people seldom, if ever, attempt to justify. Even people like Niall Ferguson say the First World War was certainly a war that easily could have been avoided if any side had just more or less conceded. Here is what Winston Churchill wrote in his book, The World Crisis, 1911 to 1918. He is First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, not just some innocent bystander. He said, "The British blockade treated the whole of Germany as if it were a beleaguered fortress, and avowedly sought to starve the whole population, men, women and children, old and young, wounded and sound, into submission." According to Martin Gilbert, a very favorable Churchill historian, he estimates that his estimate is 762,000 civilian deaths as a causal result of Britain's blockade on Germany. Now, Kaiser Wilhelm lived till his 80s in the Netherlands. He was totally fine. It was the civilian population that suffered. I'm not defending the Kaiser, who was a conscriptor. He's the one who declared war. He's terrible. It's the civilian population that ended up suffering as a causal result of Churchill's policies in a blatantly unnecessary war. So that's a little background before we get into the good war.
Yeah, and also on that stuff, if I recall, so I did a term paper in college. I took a history class on the two world wars, and my paper was on the non-neutrality of Wilson during the First World War. And that was one of the issues, that the British blockade was like just illegal. Like in terms, I forget the exact, it's like a close blockade or something like, but anyway, like what the way, so it's not just that, oh, wow, you're saying that's what you saw, 760,000 civilians, but that it was just not according to the standards of international law at the time, as far as like if you're blockading another country during war, this is how you're supposed to do it. And then, yeah, and that's partly, again, why like William Jennings Bryan resigned. He was the Secretary of State, was just the position of the Wilson administration. Like, I'm just, this is all coming back to me now, Keith. It was like the Germans were, oh, okay, so we will, how did it work? Originally, so like the German U-boats would surface and then tell, so the German U-boats were trying to like do a blockade of Great Britain. Like they're like, all right, well, you're starving us into submission. We're going to starve you into submission. So they were going after, shipping going into Great Britain. And so they would, surface and tell the merchant ship, okay, get your people out because we're going to sink you now. And then the British Admiralty gave orders to them, no, just start ramming them on sight if they do that. You see a German U-boat come up, try to ram them. So then the German U-boats, of course, weren't giving notice after that. Like, well, and then the Americans were, oh, you're just torpedoing ships without notice, you barbarians, you Huns. And so anyway, it was just when you saw the back and forth, and the Germans just kept writing cables to Washington, like, what the heck are you doing? Like, anyway, so I'll stop there, but it's all coming back to me now about how when you were taught as a little kid that, oh yeah, the Germans are always the bad guys and look at the heroic, and then you just like start seeing the play-by-play, and you're like, oh, I can kind of see why the Germans were a little bit upset in the First World War and thinking, what are you guys doing, like, to the U.S.? All right. I'm done.
I have to ask, in all your years as an economist, have you ever come across an economist who both advocates protectionism and appears to be surprised that blockades don't stimulate domestic economic growth?
No.
Okay. That's it. I just wanted to check. I'm just thinking, how do they rationalize that? Because, I mean, obviously, free trade is exploitative and you're shipping jobs overseas. So a blockade must be a great thing. Nothing comes in, nothing comes out. Everyone works within the country. This is really going to get that multiplier effect stimulated. And they never defend the many cases of their actual theories being fully embraced. So
yeah, if we want to still manage, I know we can just have a real quick aside here. Because I'm wondering, I was going through, like, trying to think, have I ever seen a MAGA type, the people who are like in favor of Trump's tariffs talk about, I guess they would say something like, oh, come on, we understand in the case of like necessities, but with the U.S. it's different because we can grow our own food and make our own semiconductors. And I guess they would say something like that. So I think, anyway, that's my guess as to how they would respond to that.
Okay. Next thing that I think is something people need to appreciate about Churchill. Andrew Roberts and Niall Ferguson said this in the most weaselly way. So Andrew Roberts is debating, the big Churchill historian, is on Piers Morgan debating Dave Smith. And he mentions that, well, what Daryl Cooper was talking about was the bombing in 1940. This is when Germany is bombing London. What he conveniently neglects to mention is that it was Britain who initiated the bombing of civilians in May of 1940, and Germany's Blitz was in September of 1940. So they just use the term 1940 and don't discriminate who actually started it. The reason we know who started it is because people who were in Winston Churchill's administration have come out and written a number of books explaining what they did and what their rationale was. The best example is Charles Percy Snow, who was a science advisor to Churchill's war government. He wrote a series of essays for Harvard University in 1961. He titled them Science and Government. Here's a quote. The paper on bombing went out to top government scientists. The paper laid down a strategic policy. The bombing must be directed essentially against German working-class houses. Middle-class houses have too much space around them, and so are bound to waste bombs. Factories and military objectives had long since been forgotten, except in official bulletins, since they were much too difficult to find and hit. The paper claimed that given a total concentration of effort on the production and use of bombing aircraft, it would be possible in all larger towns of Germany, that is, those with more than 50,000 inhabitants, to destroy 50% of all houses. This wasn't we're trying to kill Hitler, we're trying to kill Goring, we're trying to kill Hess, and we're going to take down the German National Socialist state. This was explicitly directed against the civilian population. One more example of this is from 1944. J.M. Spate was the principal assistant secretary of the Air Ministry. He wrote a book titled Bombing Vindicated. His thesis in the book is that there was so much death in the First World War that in the Second World War, bombers created a disincentive for other countries to continue fighting in wars, and they're more likely to wave the white flag early. That's his thesis. One of the quotes in this book is, retaliation was certain if we carried the war into Germany. Yet because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propagandist distortion of the truth that it was we who started the strategic offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 1940 the publicity which it deserves. That surely was a mistake. It was a splendid decision. It was as heroic, as self-sacrificing as Russia's decision to adopt her policy of scorched earth. It could have harmed us morally only if it were equivalent to an admission that we were the first to bomb towns. I have not heard Ferguson or Roberts or any of the academics respond to the fact that it was the British Empire who initiated bombing by an undemocratically elected Winston Churchill. Chamberlain had stepped down after the Narvik debacle in May of 1940, and Churchill was just appointed by Parliament. So this fight for democracy consisted of Roosevelt, who's interning Japanese by the hundreds of thousands and confiscating the nation's gold, unelected Winston Churchill, unelected Charles de Gaulle in France, And, Joseph Stalin, of course, is just too ridiculous. But Churchill also was not democratically elected in the fight for democracy. So those points, I think, are really important for people to consider.
Hey, Keith, can we just go back to the quote you read there from, is it Spate? Is that how you say his name? In the Bombing Vindicated book?
J.M. Spate, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't understand just the point he's doing. So you're saying it's clear here that they're admitting that it was the British that in May 1940 made the decision that we're going to start bombing cities, like housing, and so it's not true to say like, oh yeah, the British were only doing it after the Germans started it. And so he says retaliation was certain, but yet because we were doubtful about the psychological effect of propagandist distortion of the truth that it was we who started the strategic offensive, we have shrunk from giving our great decision of May 1940 the publicity which it deserved. So there is he saying, really we ought to be going around saying, yeah, look at the tough choice we made, and we should be celebrated that we did what we were the adults in the room and we did this great thing. But because people were worried, like, oh, I don't know, that the German propagandists might spin that and try to paint us as the bad guys. That's why we haven't been so, publicizing the fact that technically it was us who started bombing housing. Is that what he's saying there?
Yes, that's what I get from the overall thesis in his book. Okay. As I mentioned, his thesis is bombing saves tons of lives because it gets the other side to quickly raise the white flag. So the fact that we initiated this is something that should be celebrated. We should not be shying away from this at all. That's his thesis.
Okay. By the way, you skipped one that I thought was pretty good. It was your Exhibit B, that where in 1919 Churchill is saying, I don't know why we're going to these peace conferences and they're trying to outlaw the use of poison gas. I don't know why we're doing that. I just thought that was kind of funny.
That's one people can read. That was an actual memorandum written by Churchill in 1919 where he said the use of tear gas is beneficial because it can be used to spread a lively terror among uncivilized tribes. There's just so much psychopathy.
He says poison gas in the actual quote.
Yes, if you click on the link, it'll actually take you to the to the original source. The reason I didn't get that is there is so much to get to on this that one is like, well, every police team will use some sort of tear gas, and how poison was it? And he did say it shouldn't kill people. So I think that's an important exhibit for me to have in my case against him. I didn't think it was one of the top ones.
Okay, so I appreciate you're like Scott, who you're trying to emulate, that bending over backwards, that you don't have some, you've got 18 points and you don't want to have one of them be a little bit iffy if someone pushes back. But I am saying that, you weren't taking him out of context. I went through and looked, and he's saying after the great First World War and all the nations are signing things saying, hey, let's agree we're not going to use gas again, right? Because that really sucked. And Winston Churchill's like, why would we agree to that?
I don't understand the squeamishness. Yes, that was unbelievable. There is a book titled The Complete War Memoirs of Charles de Gaulle. So basically, September, let's walk through this. In August of 1939, the Germans are basically saying, we have a town, Danzig, which used to be Germany before Versailles. We have this hated minority in Poland that we want to reunify with the empire. So the question here, much like in questions of economics, should we let a company fail? To let a company fail doesn't mean everyone dies and there's no more wealth. It means the company will be under new management. The discussion was not, should everyone in Danzig live or die? The question was, should they have a different ruling class? Should they answer to Warsaw or should they answer to Berlin? That's what was at stake here. The town was 95% German. They were a hated minority after the First World War. The National Socialists invade and claim the right to rule Danzig. On September 3rd of 1939, Neville Chamberlain, along with the French government, declare war against Germany because they refused to withdraw their troops from Poland. They basically gave Poland a guarantee only against Germany. It wasn't a war guarantee because the Soviets invaded September 17th of 1939, and they never declared war against the Soviets. So the British Empire promised to declare war against Germany on behalf of Poles. This kind, virtuous maneuver from the British diplomats led to the death of 7.1 million Poles and Poland being under the Bolshevik occupation for decades to come. But yeah, it's a very nice favor, much like the kind favor we did to Ukraine when Trump sent them the Javelin missiles and Victoria Nuland installed the democratically elected Arseniy Yatsenyuk in 2014. They're always getting civilians killed for all their adventures. So after the Germans invade France because France and Britain declared war on Germany, they have the Vichy government, which answers to Berlin. The resistance government is led by Charles de Gaulle, who was allied with Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. Charles de Gaulle wrote his memoirs, and on page 104, de Gaulle explains the mindset of Winston Churchill in 1940, after May, when they started the bombing campaign of German civilians, and before September of 1940, when the Germans responded. De Gaulle says, among the many people...
So, hang on, Keith, I want to make sure I want to understand. So what you're saying here is the context of this is the British had started large air raids on German cities, population centers, and the Germans had not yet done a tit for tat.
Correct.
And so that's the context here, which again might surprise people because they would have thought, no, I thought, the Germans were the monsters and the British kept reluctantly saying, well, you leave us no choice. But okay, so that's the context. And de Gaulle even's going to be kind of surprised by Churchill's attitude in this quote.
Correct. If you go to his memoirs, he writes, this is one of those quotes that I had to buy the book and read for myself because I just couldn't believe it. De Gaulle says, among the people, many in their desire to emerge from an almost unbearable tension went so far as to say out loud that they wished the enemy would risk attack. Foremost among them, Mr. Churchill found the waiting hard to bear. I can still see him at Shakur's one August day, raising his fist toward the sky as he cried, so they won't come? Are you in such a hurry, I said to him, to see your town smashed to bits? You see, he replied, the bombing of Oxford, Coventry, Canterbury will cause such a wave of indignation in the United States that they'll come into the war. So we have very good evidence from a primary source on someone who was in the know that it was Churchill who actively wanted the Germans to bomb Britain. This is the public servant who was the great defender of Britain, who wanted British towns to be bombed so it would motivate Roosevelt and the American people and, to disavow the America First Committee by Charles Lindbergh and really get behind the war effort in Europe's Second World War. Even after the major disasters of the First World War, this was being pushed by someone who was blindly admired by so many millions of people.
And also, too, it's just to be clear here, I mean, it's probably obvious, but it's not merely that he's saying, we're just sitting here minding our own business, trying to do everything we can to protect our people. But I have to admit, if the Germans were to somehow slip through our defenses and hit us, I guess the silver lining on that would be the U.S. No, he's saying we are intentionally provoking them. We want them to say, well, you're going to keep bombing us. Well, we have no choice. We're going to have to start bombing your towns too, because our people are going to start saying, what's up, guys? You're not protecting us. And so that just adds an extra layer to it, that he's there admitting it's not Keith who's making up, paranoid conspiracy theories. That no, the point of the, among other possible objectives of them starting the bombing in May was like, this will provoke the Germans to retaliate. And then we can go to the Americans and you see what monsters these people are. Look what they're doing. They're bombing our civilians.
Exactly. Just as in our previous discussion, Secretary of War Henry Stimson said in his own diaries on December 7th of 1941, when I got the news of Hawaii, my first feeling was of relief. The indecision was finally over. These people have every incentive to have somewhat of a small attack so it can justify something they already wanted to do. The case is obvious when it comes to the benefits of the Bush administration to 9/11. Bush's approval rating went to 91%, and he got a total blank check to do whatever he wanted. Roosevelt, the case is also obvious. It was a diversionary foreign policy tactic. His Great New Deal led to the Double Dip Recession of 1937, and he had to seek some way to distract the population and get them angry and on board with something else. So politicians, because they have the exact opposite incentive of what the private sector does, they have every incentive to get the population either fighting with foreign enemies or fighting amongst each other, knowing that they will be the ones who they look to increase the amount of power and social status they have to come to the rescue of all of us who are just too dumb to cooperate voluntarily. So there are so many libertarian lessons to extract from all of these.
Okay. Do you want to? I know you got a list here. You want so on a lot of this, folks. I'll do the devil's advocate and push back against Keith, but why don't we, Keith, you want to just keep going through your case against Churchill, and then I'll save some of my just general, what about this, Keith, for the end?
Sure. Let's go through a few more. There was something referred to as Operation Catapult. This would have been in July of 1940. Churchill authorized the bombing of a French naval ship off the coast of Algeria, killing 1,297 French soldiers. The International Churchill Society actually commented on this, and they didn't say, no, this is a conspiracy theory, this didn't happen at all. They actually say, I want to summarize this quote. Churchill had to make a choice. He could either trust the promises of the new French government, the Vichy government, that they would never hand over their ships to Hitler, or he could make sure that the ships never join the German Navy by destroying them himself. So even, it's not just, well, it's Churchill versus Hitler. There's many cases of it's Churchill versus the civilian population of Germany. But it's not just Churchill versus Germany. It's also Churchill versus the civilian population of allied nations. So any way you try to say, well, it was us versus them, there's not that clear of a line in the us versus them when politicians claim the right to rule you and kill you if it benefits them in their struggle against whoever their current enemy is. I think that is something very few people know about. And if Pearl Harbor on its face is unjustifiable because another country killed a bunch of our soldiers, this is in principle no different. And it's important that people know about it.
Okay. Again, you went through that fast. Let me just make sure everyone got that. So the French, Hitler blitzkrieg comes in, the French surrender, and then off the coast of Algeria, there were a bunch of French naval ships, and the concern was from the UK government that if Hitler gets his hands on those ships, then he's going to be able to invade us, right? And so they just decided to bomb. They didn't, in the French, government would assured them, oh no, we're not going to give our naval ships to Hitler. We just said, we're going to stop fighting you, but don't worry, we wouldn't do that to you guys. And then, as you say, this International Churchill Society is explaining, well, no, Churchill couldn't trust the French government to do that, and so they decided, let's just take it off the chessboard, and they bombed those French naval ships that were off the coast of Algeria, and as you say, it killed, the estimate is 1,297 French soldiers. So
so this also gets into the question of who actually supports the troops. You have Democrats, neocons, and Republicans constantly saying we need to support the troops and support the military, even though the policies they advocate end up with more dead soldiers than anyone who advocates diplomacy or negotiation or free trade or anything like that. So when people say, I support the troops, you have to ask, when they say, I support Ukraine, and their policies result in millions of Ukrainians getting conscripted and hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians, you have to be willing to say, you don't support Ukraine. We, the anti-war advocates, the people who advocate the non-aggression principle and diplomacy, we are much bigger supporters of Ukraine than you people. I don't even like them taking the moral high ground on any of this. So again, these are the people who claim to support the troops so much, and their policies lead to so many dead troops, just like so much else in politics.
And again, with that, it's because you could say, like with the German civilians, well, yeah, it's it's a shame, but I guess that's what happens when your government goes to war. But then with this one, it's like, yeah, it's a shame we had to kill all those French soldiers, but that's what happens when your ally loses to your enemy and you have no choice but to kill them. So
They get in such twists. It's really sickening. But that is what the cult of statism does to the brain of an otherwise good person. There is one thing that I mentioned here, which I think is important because it gets to Churchill's intentions. So often in politics, we will say something like, it's not the intention that matters, it's the result. Intention does matter somewhat. I mean, consider you and I are at the next Mises conference in October, which I cannot wait for. It's going to be awesome. And I slip and I accidentally hit you with a knife and I cut you. Compare this to, I say, I hate that Bob's show has more viewers than me. I'm going to stab Bob. Well, even though the same thing resulted, what's in my mind and my intentions are so different that it tells you I'm actually a really bad, envious psychopath who needs to be put away versus someone who just was careless or had an accident. So intention does matter. So in this exhibit that I get into in the article, I titled it Intention of Continental Monopoly. This gets into Churchill's mindset of the Second World War. And this is a quote from Churchill in an exchange he had with Lord Londonderry, who was the leader of the House of Lords, on May 4th of 1935, according to Martin Gilbert, very pro-Churchill historian. Londonderry says to Churchill, I should like to get out of your mind what appears to be a strong anti-German obsession. Churchill responded, you are mistaken in supposing that I have an anti-German obsession. British policy for 400 years has been to oppose the strongest power in Europe by weaving together a combination of other countries strong enough to face the bully. Sometimes it is Spain, sometimes the French monarchy, sometimes the French Empire, sometimes Germany. I have no doubt who it is now. But if France set up to claim the overlordship of Europe, I should equally endeavor to oppose them. It is thus, through the centuries, we have kept our liberties and maintained our life and power. So this is proof, very good reasoning, I should say, maybe not total proof, that it's not like, well, Churchill saw what was going on in 1939 and said, my hands are tied, we're going to have to wage a defensive war. This was the plan, that they are the monopolist on the continent, just as Lincoln would not allow the South to secede and become a competitor to the Union government. Churchill was not going to allow Germany to expand in wealth, power, and prestige to become a competitor to the British Empire, who I think at the time controlled, was calling the shots for like 20% of the planet between Britain and all of its colonies. So really, if anyone could be accused of attempting to take over the world, it's the Bolsheviks who, with their third Comintern meeting, said global socialism, international socialism, is the goal of Bolshevism, and the British Empire could be accused of trying to take over the world with all its colonies and all its power and prestige. And its conscripted military and everything else that goes along with that. So the fact that we have reason to believe that Churchill, just like any other statesman, basically would not allow any competitor. He knew what the state was. The state is a monopoly on violence. We don't tolerate competition, just as Lincoln did, just as Vladimir Zelensky is not going to allow Donetsk and Luhansk to secede and join the Russian Federation. Churchill was not willing to have a competitor on the continent. This gets into his intentions, which are very different from what historians tell us, which is his hands were tied, and in 1939, he reluctantly came in.
Well, so thank you for all that. But also, that's interesting, too, because what I have seen, the movie, did you see the movie, Keith? Now I'm blanking out.
Their Finest Hour?
Yes, so the guy was playing. It was an actor that he's an amazing actor, Gary Oldman, when he played Churchill. What was
Darkest Hour? Yes, I did see that.
Okay, so in that one of the themes of that was the reason Churchill was so awesome is he saw the threat from Hitler before lots of other people did, and while they're all trying to do diplomacy, Churchill just was on that guy, and he just knew, nope, this guy, we got to take him out sooner rather than later. And so what I like, Keith, about this quote you gave, it's not that it contradicts that perspective, but in the context, like knowing what we know about Hitler, you're right. That almost comes off as, and because Churchill knew, I don't like this raging anti-Semite, and we're going to have to contain him. It's more, you know what I mean? That him saying, well, no, it's not that I'm against Germany per se. I'm against anybody that's, expansionary. So it's, whereas, in that 1935, it's not that he said, no, I'm telling you, this chancellor, I've read Mein Kampf, and this guy, this is a one bad dude, and we got to watch out for this guy because he's pure evil. That's not what he was saying. Like you're saying, it was just, yeah, they're expansionary, and they're going to try to, restrict what we can do. And, so we would, if Spain were doing the same thing, I would be anti-Spain right now. So in other words, it's not that he, among other mere mortals, saw the threat posed by Hitler, is what I'm getting at.
Correct. And in that movie, there's a scene where Churchill is just riding the train and he doesn't want to go to war, but the people are saying, won't you protect us? Won't you defend us? That is one of the most amazing propaganda films that I had ever seen. It was years and years ago when I'd seen that. I should watch it again just to do a review. But yeah, that movie is so crazy and pathetic. And the ultimate lesson from a film like that is it's not that there were any explicit lies. It's that things were actively left out. So this is how we can come to the conclusion that there's no such thing really as bias and unbiased. Everyone has their bias simply by me focusing on Churchill and not Lincoln or Stalin or Oliver Cromwell. That is a bias. You're prioritizing one thing over another. So once we recognize that everyone is biased, we can actually get to criticizing the exact arguments instead of the response to Tucker Carlson was just to call him a National Socialist sympathizer. Absolutely so pathetic. And there's this quote, which was very interesting. Churchill wrote 6 books after the Second World War, and they're his war memoirs. The first one is titled The Gathering Storm. And this is the very first one. And he says, this is in the preface to the book. The human tragedy reaches its climax in the fact that after all the exertions and sacrifices of hundreds of millions of people and the victories of the righteous cause, we have still not found peace or security, and that we lie in the grip of even worse perils than those we have surmounted. In other words, we fought this war for Polish independence, and Poles had a bunch of death and trauma and cities destroyed. And Poland is under Bolshevik occupation, along with Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, Hungary, all of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland. So these are the downsides that even Winston Churchill was willing to admit in his own book, that people just say, well, nope, the Second World War was one of these great things. That's the great propaganda trick. Whenever they tell you there's only benefits to something or only costs, whereas the economists will look at both the costs and benefits of a given situation. The propagandists always leave that out. I have Churchill's own words to summarize the downsides of the Second World War.
Yeah, and it's it was a. I'm not. I'm going to be able to do it. Oh, years ago, when I was debating this, the U.S. entry in the Second World War, I summarized something like, "Well, yeah, the U.S. of course had to go in because otherwise half of Europe would have fallen under the control of an evil dictator or something like that." And then people get that is what happened anyway. So.
Exactly. So I think those are the primary points. Of course, I have more if people would like to read the article. I am totally open to any responses. We don't have to go an hour if we want to keep this shorter. I think it's really important that people have that information because it's one of these. Hans Hoppe summarized the importance of historical narratives as the prevailing interpretation of historical events matters because the opportunity cost of getting totally informed about everything the government does is so difficult. It takes so much time. Things change so much. You don't know who to believe. So people go with these cheap historical narratives. FDR ended the Great Depression, Lincoln abolished slavery, and Churchill saved Western civilization. And Herbert Hoover sat on his hands and decreased government spending to near zero in 1929. These myths are so powerful because they affect the modern day. So that's why I appreciate you having me on to discuss this. I'm more than open to any criticisms of this thesis.
Well, so one thing I wanted to, so thank you for that. One thing I wanted to bring up was, did you consider and then just not include, or was it not in your radar? A big thing when people talk about Great Britain and Churchill in particular was what he did to India and how he diverted food or something like that. Was that on your radar?
Yeah. So the thesis is that in Bengal, there was a famine in 1943 and Churchill allocated food away from people during a surplus of rice. He chose to feed the soldiers as opposed to letting it stay in Bengal. So much of those are actively promoted by so many historians and academics, and that is the small downside. Much like they'll say, well, the bad thing about Jefferson and Washington was anytime they could find a social justice bent to something, they'll say, yeah, there is one criticism. They were bad to the natives and they were bad to minorities. With Churchill, it's like, well, yes, he was great against the Germans, but he was bad in India and Bengal and really was a racist, eugenicist, imperialist. That has been said so many times that that's the one caveat. They go, all right, he wasn't totally perfect. He still was a bigot, and that's why today we need to increase our fight against bigotry and embrace DEI and have Robin DiAngelo speak for $100,000 an hour.
Okay, so just to be clear, you're saying, yeah, that is, but just like if you were coming to give the revisionist account of, George Washington or something, you wouldn't bring, you'd bring up the slavery stuff just because, like, we all know that. I'm talking about something. Is that what you're saying? But as far as it goes, that is, like, people who are upset at him for that, like, you think that's a fair accusation? Or is that something that...
Yes, I do think it's a fair accusation. Okay. He certainly wasn't a free market voluntarist by any stretch, and
right.
This is the very imperialism with regard to the economic structure that so many Democrats discuss. But just as in my analysis of American history, everyone has heard about slavery and Jim Crow so many times. It's been discussed so unproductively so many times. I didn't think that that's what I assume so many people who would read this already know about that. They often neglect the crimes against German civilians and Polish civilians and British civilians, these people who suffered. But every single historian at the colleges I went to, Arizona State, Grand Canyon University, had always said, yeah, Churchill was a racist and a bigot. Other than that, he was terrific. Yeah. So because so many people know about that, I didn't think to prioritize it.
Gotcha. So one thing that you did touch here, and I just want to ask you, what's interesting is, and kind of perverse, whenever people bring up the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of the lines of defense will be to say, well, look at the firebombing of Dresden. And so that's basically the same thing. It's just a matter of, technique, which is just like, well, right. And that was pretty awful too. You know what I mean? Like they're almost making it like, because we built up with the leading to the firebombing of Dresden. And you didn't touch on this here, but I mean, just for people to know, like I've read accounts where they would do things like they would send one wave, and just deliberately, when we say firebombing, like the point was to make all the buildings catch on fire. And then they would, just send one wave and then wait for all the emergency personnel, like the firefighting crews, to show up and then send another wave to make sure you took them out. You know what I mean? Like, so strategic, just to think through what's the way we can just burn as much as possible and completely wipe this city out. And so, again, like you'd say, well, given that you're going to drop one wave, why not hold back to make sure then you hit all the firefighters too and kill them? But I don't know. That just seems extra gruesome to me that we should at least be aware of as we sit here and talk about how great Winston Churchill and the Allies were in World War II.
Oh, and that's why the advent of television was so important to changing public opinion with regard to the Vietnam War, because people saw war as, well, it's on this battlefield and the soldiers are shooting and then the generals are calling the shots and then they're surrendering in some battles, winning in others. It's all very vague. But during Vietnam, people were actually able to see the devastation and the destruction of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia on their screens, and then it became real to them. This is the classic expression. I'm sure it's a fake quote by Stalin. One death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. If you look at people's response to the killing of Eric Garner, totally unjustified police killing that took place, compare that to when you tell someone that Pol Pot killed millions of people in Cambodia. It's hard for them to get so riled up about a statistic like that, but them seeing something directly, that even if it's only against one person, that really builds up the emotions that otherwise wouldn't exist. So today, when it comes to Israeli crimes in Gaza and Syria and Lebanon. People are actually able to see this, and they're actually able to comprehend what's happening. When people read about we bombed Germany or the British bombed Germany, there's only so much you can articulate in a news article. And what are they going to have? One or two pictures of it's going to be black with some outline of a little mushroom cloud. That really doesn't get at people's emotions. So fortunately, we have the advent of both television and internet connectivity. We have so many people that have cell phones, thanks to the free market and big companies like Steve Jobs allocating them to millions of people. We're much more likely to get people on the anti-war page when they actually know what they're advocating, as opposed to the vagaries of Britain bombed Germany or Britain went to war with Germany. This actually means dead human beings. People think they're so virtuous to say we should not tolerate. Josh Hawley is like, well, we should not tolerate Visa and MasterCard having an 80% market share. I am taking a moral stand. Then you just see these villages wiped out. First of all, it's more a voluntary exchange than just some coercive monopoly in that case. Second of all, if you're going to claim the moral high ground, you have to be willing to say these mass murder campaigns of civilians are unequivocally wrong. So, yeah, basically all these politicians are far worse than Osama bin Laden when it comes to death count. And they have the same reason. They're always doing it for the greater good every single time. I've yet to hear a dictator say, I'm the bad guy in this. What do you think, soldiers? Yep, soldiers were on the bad team in this one. They all think they're doing the right thing. Let's just embrace the non-aggression principle and stop having double standards.
Well, the other reason, at the start of that, in terms of the anecdote versus the statistic, that the Eric Garland case is, considered an outrage, whereas Pol Pot, it's because the police in the U.S. are fascist, but Pol Pot was a communist. So when communists wipe people out, it doesn't count. Okay, so as we wind up here, let me just go ahead and do the obligatory response to all this. I'll try not to make it cliched, but fine, Keith. Yeah, you know that, but you know what? The Third Reich was bad, and they were trying to take over, and all you're doing is showing. So I could flip it around on you and say, yeah, there's no solutions, there's only trade-offs, and you're talking about all the downsides to what the Allies did. But can you imagine how bad it would have been had they done nothing and let Germany win? And can you imagine, all the atrocities the Germans would have committed had they not been stopped, and the Japanese as well. So, yeah, war sucks. No kidding. What if somebody says something like that?
Oh, yeah. And I make the case that the Third Reich is just a National Socialist state that was more horrible than people imagine. I quote the Diary of Goebbels, where he says about 40% of the Jews will have to be liquidated. The rest can be used for forced labor. The National Socialists were absolutely evil. None of that justifies initiating a conflict over a city that is 95% German. That is the first thing. The second is people assume this domino theory that if you let one fall, then then countries just continue to fall. They don't account for the fact that every expansion is both an asset and a liability. That's why this overexpansion led to the British Empire falling at the end of the Second World War. They did not have enough men or resources or enough printing power to maintain their empire. Empires die from overexpansion. The Kaiser's empire fell after the First World War. The Austro-Hungarian Empire fell as a cause result of their expansion. We have every reason to believe that Hitler's empire would have fallen as a causal result of continuous expansion. The Soviet Empire fell as a causal result of expansion. The Japanese Empire, which was occupying Korea and Vietnam and the Philippines and a number of other places, they fell as a causal result of expansion. So it's not that they just become more and more powerful and they just get more and more tyrannical, and then one day they end up taking over the whole world. We have to weigh the costs and benefits of, all right, the city of Danzig is in question. What are the costs and benefits of them having their allegiance to Berlin versus their allegiance to Warsaw? We have to do the same thing. If the Donbass answers to Moscow instead of Kiev, how many people are we willing to get killed? The best test for this is to say it's impossible to have like a total principle that's besides the non-aggression principle, which will apply in every example because so many things are unforeseeable. The best case is if our domestic government did this to us, would we have the right to wage war against them in response? So the claim is they wanted to occupy and control a city that was 95% German. If the federal government wants to have a monopoly on Florida and not let Florida secede, is it worth conscripting millions of people to fight a war against the federal government for Floridian independence? That almost actually might have happened in 2020 when only DeSantis wasn't doing lockdowns with Kristi Noem. But that is a much better test. The current test is we should always write a blank check no matter what when any foreign dictator potentially threatens the freedom of people. A much better test that we could use is if our domestic government did this to us, would we have the right to violently resist? Just as they're constantly saying we should violently resist the government of Vladimir Putin, the government of Xi Jinping, and the government of the Ayatollah. So that is a productive way to extract a lesson. Yes, it could have been bad. We never know how bad it would have been. We have every reason to believe that Hitler's ultimate ambition was simply just a full-on war against what he referred to as Judeo-Bolshevism in Mein Kampf. He certainly wanted war with the Soviets. There's no reason to believe that he wanted war with Britain or France. But the counter-argument to that is he did declare war against America as a result of the treaty that he had with Japan. He did declare war against America December 11th of 1941, but it's just a little shallow when I have a domestic government that claims the right to cage me for 300,000 victimless crimes. That's according to Senator Mike Lee, 300,000 federal regulations that are on the books that we can't read, but yet have to comply with. Take 40% of your income, regulate every commercial interaction. They're trying to cage Roger Ver for 109 years because he didn't pay fake taxes when he denounced his citizenship. When I get all these freedom violations, I'm supposed to worry about a potential hypothetical freedom violation in the future if we don't immediately conscript millions of people and immediately start murdering civilians. Just don't have double standards. That's a much better approach than always declare war if there's any potential threat of freedom from a foreign adversary.
I see you feel strongly about this topic. So,
I think it was the 30th person I came across who told me that I should be conscripted to fight with the Banderites in Ukraine against Russia, that I finally got a little more passionate about this than anything else. The best was a woman the other day telling me all men in America should be conscripted into the IDF to fight against Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, and Iran. So you just get enough of this to where you just get so sick of it, and you have to defend hypothetical violations of freedom when actual freedoms, they constantly want to take away more of the freedom. I can't even get school choice in the country that confiscates 40% of my income, but I have to be terrified that people in Taiwan, Taipei, are going to answer to Beijing instead of Taipei, even though by any reasonable metric, if you talk to someone in Taiwan, that nothing much is going to change. We're just as we trade billions and trillions with China, we'd still trade trillions with Taiwan. So I am just so sick of how loose they are and how easily they'll say, we might have to start a mass murder campaign. We might have to enslave millions of people to get their limbs blown off. But, it's for democracy, which, if you haven't read Democracy, the God That Failed, democracy is basically mob rule by the ignorant, where for the same reason people don't change the oil on a rent-a-car, they're not going to really take care of the country that they claim to be ruling over when they're only temporary caretakers. So I just get so sick of the mass murder justification. It's so evil, and then they claim the moral high ground. So that's why I think lessons like this are very important.
Well, I would just say in closing that the next time that lady says that to you, you just say, ma'am, I'm a lover, not a fighter. And then I think that will get her to stop in her tracks. Well, Keith, where do people go if they want to read more of your analysis of past and current controversies and historical events?
They can find me on YouTube. It's titled the Don't Tread on Anyone podcast. Keith and I don't tread on anyone. More importantly, we just published a book titled Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. This is really decades of research by Scott Horton, but especially the last 2 years. He's only left his house like 2 times. He took Tom out on the boat, and he took Connor and I out on the boat. Other than that, he's worked 2 years on this thesis. And basically his thesis is the current war in Ukraine is basically a proxy war between America and the Russians. This is a causal result of three things: the U.S. leaving the Open Skies Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and the INF Treaty. Second, the color revolutions that took place in Georgia and Ukraine. And most importantly, the expansion of NATO west after the German reunification, February 9th of 1990. I believe that took place. Scott has a 700-page book defending this thesis. I think it's one of the most important works out there. The less people are able to be swindled by the Vladimir Zelenskys who did the people fighting for democracy, just like Churchill and Stalin. Zelensky just canceled his election of this year. That's the guy fighting for democracy. I think it was March 31st of 2024. He just completely ignored it. So he's not democratic anymore. Not to mention his no-leave policy for all men ages 18 to 61, his enslavement of men over the age of 25, his confiscation of property from the Orthodox Church. They completely monopolized the media in Ukraine. They bombed Poland on November 15th of 2022, and Zelensky and the Associated Press came out and blamed Russia, saying Russia bombed a NATO member and we're going to have a second world war. That's who we're defending in Ukraine. Scott's book is terrific, makes an excellent case about it. The title's Provoked. People can check that out at libertarianinstitute.org.
Okay, well, thanks, folks. My guest has been Keith Knight. Keith, thank you for your time and your passion.
I appreciate it, Bob. Take care.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. See you next time.
You've just experienced another episode of The Bob Murphy Show, the podcast promoting free markets, free minds, and grateful souls. For more information and to subscribe to this podcast, visit bobmurphyshow.com.